So thank you to Rune, Brendan, everyone in the department. It's nice to be here, um, and we're here. Um, Hi, folks, again. So a few weeks ago, I was actually in an extreme state of here-ness. I was collecting a bunch of Tibor Common related material for my advanced type course here at Parsons. And when I got Rune's email, I was super excited. Like, what luck? What's more relevant to the topic of authenticity than Tibor Common? Um, I was especially excited about a reading that I'd tracked down. Tibor and Carrie Jacobs' "We're Here to Be Bad" from 1990. I'd finally been able to get the actual back issue of Print magazine of when it was originally printed. And it's kind of amazing. I'll talk about it in a second. But basically, I was so excited, I actually considered even stealing their title for this talk. But I wasn't quite sure of that Tibor's idea of badness was really appropriate for this. Um, Specifically, design badness, being bad in his case, in opposition to design good, like good design. I didn't think it was really relevant now. So I wanted to go with something that was a little bit more specific for what I want to talk about. Specifically, we're here to wrong, wrong, shiny, shiny, choo choo. And this is my official title for the talk. Um, I want to talk about a few things, good versus bad, like I've already mentioned, authentic versus inauthentic, success versus failure in design. I've kind of noticed, especially on social media these days, there's a tendency to view work in really extreme terms. It's either extremely good, extremely bad, it's totally authentic, or totally inauthentic. Or it could even be iconic or completely canceled. But I'm interested in work that sort of blurs those boundaries or manages to be both places at the same time. And so I want to talk about two pieces of design that I've been really inspired by, things that I think about a lot, things that like make me bring up a lot of questions about what it means to design and what is good design specifically. The first is record cover for the group The Four Seasons, their album Genuine Imitation Life Gazette from 1969, designed by Don Snyder with Desmond Strobel. This is the cover. I feel I need to turn around, probably not necessary. So as you can see, the cover is done like a newspaper. I don't know if it was the first record cover that was ever made like a newspaper, but it was one of the first, and then kind of set off a trend. John Lennon and Yoko Ono did one a few years later. Jethro Tull did one a few years later. But basically, the year was 1969. The Four Seasons were kind of at their peak cultural level, starting to fade off, and feeling the pressure of the rise of psychedelia in culture. Everybody was into Sergeant Pepper. Everybody was into turning on, tuning in, dropping out, and all that stereotypical stuff. And they wanted to ride that wave. The main songwriter of the group teamed up with another songwriter that he actually saw play at a coffee shop in Greenwich Village. And they decided to create a concept album about the issues America was facing at the time. So instead of the normal Four Seasons stuff, Sherry, some of the other Ragdoll, all the classic Jersey Boys hits, they did this psychedelic concept album that was a musical suite. Um, the album cover is extremely lavish for the period. It has a double gatefold. I think that's the proper term. And the whole thing is completely full of incredible details. The type is also incredibly well done too. Here's a close up of a comic making fun of the Beatles, a few general hippie jokes, nice Uncle Sam thing. And then inside the second gatefold is a little mini newspaper. So this is the actual photo of the group at the time. Not the most, not really hip, not really unhip, but the Four Seasons were popular, but not counterculture. And the whole thing is kind of interesting because it's incredibly well done. It's incredibly detailed. Basically, everything you look for in a design project. This was done in one of my classes. If this was done as like a thesis project, you would say like, okay, this is an incredible success. Another thing about it that makes it really authentic is that it's a recreation of a certain existing thing. They did a newspaper, fake newspaper, but it's authentic to the means of production. Everything is done exactly how it would have been done if you were producing your own newspaper. These are some tiny little ads that are behind me actually. Um, Fake ads. There's a real crossword puzzle. Everything, the details are just so like completely incredible. You kind of can't get over it. Keep finding new things. And they even went far enough to have legit underground comics artists do a comics page. It's clear that the record label Philips had a ton of money that they were throwing at this. It's clear that the guys that were working on this realized that this was an opportunity. So again, Don Snyder and Desmond Strobel, I always get their names confused. Don Snyder went on to be, or was a photographer. I think he was, the credits aren't super clear, but I think he was probably the art director for the project. Desmond Strobel was the guy that was in charge of all the graphics. He had a career as a record cover designer, among other things, was the designer for Pink Floyd's Rumors. Um, they basically like saw this as an opportunity to do something really cool, put everything they could into it, and made a kind of amazing thing. I would not be shocked if there isn't anyone in the room that's ever heard of this, partly because the record was almost total flop. It did all right, but they didn't have any singles. And it's kind of crazy to the point that the band, the Four Seasons, which still exists, Frankie Valli does his thing, Jersey Boys was a big hit. They don't mention the album at all. The guy that wrote the songs will talk about it in interviews, but everybody's just kind of like pushed it aside. To a certain degree, it's a total failure because of that. The cover is really busy. But most importantly, it doesn't really fit what we think of as the group, and so in a sense, it's inauthentic. The production is authentic, but the culture aspect of it is inauthentic. The other record that I wanted to talk about that is almost the opposite is a dub reggae group, the Congos. Their album, The Heart of the Congos, designed by Gillian A. Gordon in 1977. And this is the cover. The handwriting at the top is not original, but still pretty cool. This was a production of the great Lee Perry, one of the most influential like dub reggae producers of all time. It's considered to be one of the best dub reggae albums of all time, and it is just a really amazing album. The cover I find fascinating, A, because it's great, but B, because it's also not great at the same time. It basically does all of the things that I try to teach my students in core type. It does the things that I tell them not to do. There are a number of things that could either be mistakes or could be intentional, and it's hard to tell, which is where it gets fuzzy. So this is the front cover. It's got this interesting and appropriate picture of the main members of the group playing congos. But it's also kind of strange. It feels almost randomly chosen. The back cover, this is the full thing. If we look at it in detail, you can see some of the weirdness in the type. The column with the song titles, if you notice carefully, the spacing is totally off. The side 2 is a little bit shifted. There's an arbitrary space between side 1 and side 2. There's a weird mixture of Times Roman and Univers that seems to exist for no specific reason. And then to top it all off, the display typeface is a really weird, semi-obscure Letraset typeface, originally released in 1973, Beans, by Dieter Zimtsch of West Germany. It was a winning typeface from Letraset, had a competition in 1973 to people could just submit typefaces, and they picked all the winning ones and released those. Part of the weirdness of this cover comes obviously from the fact that it was done as a stub. So this would have been an actual person sitting down with reproduced images of type, letraset that they were rubbing down manually, doing it on a board at actual size and getting it to work. Normally in a paste up, you want to make sure that everything lines up, everything is really precise. But in this case, they're kind of like doing something just to get it out. Um, One of the most fascinating things to me is, I'm not sure how clear, yeah, you can see it up there. The label of the record is not cut in a perfect circle. There's actually like a sort of series of notches around it, which raises the question, A, were there issues in cutting perfect circles in Jamaica at that point? Or B, did they just not care? Were they trying to be rough on purpose? And then my favorite detail of the whole thing is the stripes on the front cover sort of famously were originally printed in the wrong color. They were supposed to be green stripes with red underneath, obviously to represent the colors of Jamaica, but they came back blue stripes with red. Lee Perry was completely freaked out, did not want the colors of Babylon, i.e. USA, on the cover. And so Ja Wise, who was one of the members of the whole shebang, was instructed to actually hand paint a batch of the colors with yellow paint to make it green again. And so all of these original pressings are basically totally unique. The stripes were all different. So again, like I'm fascinated by this, A, because it's like totally amazing. It feels like this kind of like holy object. But B, it does things that, again, you're not technically supposed to do as a designer, but it's still good. It's bad and good. So let's look at both of them again. Looking at the Four Seasons, it's the one that's definitely more professional. All of the production is totally perfect. Everything lines up. Everything is exactly in the place it should be. The Congos is the exact opposite. Nothing is where it should be. Everything is kind of weird and strange. And I'm interested in the sort of intersection between these two. Like, what does that mean? So to go back to the original sort of pirated title that I was thinking about using, this is a spread from Tibor and Carrie Jacobs' We're Here to Be Bad. This is the original one scanned from a bound copy of print magazine that I was able to get from the library here at the New School. I had heard about this essay for a while. I'd actually used it in classes, but hadn't seen the original thing. And it originally struck me as kind of like a really neat manifesto of Tibor's practice. He basically argues against good design, or at least the concept of good design that existed in the 80s of like corporate perfection, and argued that basically we need to inject badness. We need to inject art into commerce. The details of the design are really, really, really fascinating, and I find like completely relevant to the sort of work that I find interesting right now. This also has a lot of sort of arbitrary decisions, a lot of wrong choices, a lot of awkward moments. They mix lots and lots of different typefaces. If you look around, you'll see that anything they're highlighting, they basically switch it to a different font. One of my favorite things, the word selling out is overprinted on top. It's basically enlarged and prints over a paragraph of some of the words. And then maybe my other favorite thing, there's an actual mistake in the layout. If you look up at the top image over there, you'll notice a whole line of type is printed under the image. And I honestly don't know if this was intentional or not. You can't read what it says underneath. And it could be a mess up. It would be a ridiculous mess up, but it's still fascinating. I also love the bold move of having the like generic free Art Deco font right in the middle of the text. But so anyway, this is totally fascinating. There's so much that you can learn about and read about, so much you can tell about the meaning of this text just by looking at it. The version that I was most familiar with is something that was on somebody's website. I don't even remember where, because the website, the link doesn't even work anymore, but just a plain text version. And a lot of the readings that I use in my classes are things that I encounter either like this or republished in some form, basically retypeset. And I think that there's a certain sort of authenticity to the real object and an inauthenticity to the retypeset version. And it brings to mind an idea that I think of a lot, that design texts are never really just texts. If you're reading an article, an essay, a piece of criticism that's designed by a designer, the image of it, the visual language is as important or sometimes more important than the text itself. And so in my advanced type course here at Parsons, I assign a really obnoxious number of readings for my students to poke at. And I've been going out of my way to find the original version. And I found that no matter what the original version is, no matter how bad it is, you can get more context by looking at the original version and understanding basically how the thing was made. One of the wildest examples that I've found so far is, so this is the transcribed version of Catherine McCoy and David Frege's Typography as Discourse from 1989. And this is a text that I had assigned because it fits in with the whole 80s, 90s postmodernism shift. And again, I always liked it. It felt like a nice little manifesto, but I always wondered what it looked like. And then when I actually look it up, this is the actual printing from, blanking right now, I'm going to say Communication Arts back in again, 1989. So this was 2 spreads. This is the first spread that we're seeing right now. And the design is completely crazy. It's sideways. There are illustrations that illustrate the topic. You can basically glance at it and immediately tell what's going on here. In the middle of a magazine that's filled with 2-column text, black and white ads and things like this, something like this jumps out. It screams at you what the message is. A subtler distinction, but I find to be, again, really interesting, is the Crystal Goblet, which is actually really originally titled Printing Should Be Invisible by Beatrice Ward. Anyone that's ever taken a design course or graduated has read this at some point. You've probably seen it in a pure text format. People will retype it. You'll design a little book for it. It's great. It's a really important text. When it was originally done, I actually haven't been able to find the absolute first printed version because it was done in a British printing newspaper that I think I have to go to the British Library to find. But the earliest I could find is this 1937 edition printed actually here in New York at the Marchbanks Press. This is in the NYU library if anybody wants to see the actual book. Seeing the original, I believe, gives more context and a greater understanding to what the article is about. When you see it as a retyped text, it just feels like language. But here you get a sense of the whole idea of fine printing that she was talking about, the whole idea of this sort of purist Eurocentric typography that she was advocating. Possibly even better is the version from the library here at the New School. This is from the 1955 collection of her essays. And this is completely densely layered with decades of annotations by New School students for a really long time. You get this sort of sense of institutional memory of how the school has processed this article. So it's really visually beautiful, but also at the same time kind of really clarifies her idea of a text being a sort of neutral space that allows room for the reader. So continuing on the reading idea, and to go back to Tibor again, this is Tibor and J. Abbott Miller and Carrie Jacobs' article from 1991, Good History and Bad History. I like it because it also is much better in the actual designed version than the typeset version. But it also talks about one of the things that I wanted to bring up. So here there's a big quote up at the top. So in it talks about the whole idea of good history and bad history. Good history in general presents ideas in context in a way that teaches us more than how things once looked. It's not just a roster of names, dates, and battles, but the history of how we have come to believe what we believe about the world. Likewise, good design history is not just a roster of names, dates, and objects. It is the history of how we have come to believe what we believe about design. And so this gets back to my main point. The design is never really just about form, but instead about everything that happens in and around the work itself. Design is always a means to an end and a connector to other worlds and other possibilities. So this slide is intentionally blank. Now I want to talk about 3 diagrams for evaluating and discussing design. So the essays and articles are a really good way to sort of unpack the ideas behind how things are made, behind certain movements. But I'm also interested in sort of tools that can allow us to talk about work and to place it in a certain context and sort of unpack it and understand it. So these 3 diagrams that I'm about to show are ones that I find all work together really well to kind of expand how we think about something beyond like the simple iconic or canceled binary that everybody's into. The first is Lorraine Wild's Great Wheel of Style. I first encountered this in iMagazine sometime around like 2000. And this, like any good diagram, illustrates like a really, really simple point well. And here she's talking about how style can be recirculated and come back to itself. So something can go from mass market to being an embarrassment, then back to being a fetish, and then back to being interesting, and then eventually circling back to good style. It's useful because you can see how these things connect, but also how everything can kind of cycle back. When you realize that this is the way that style works, you can basically hop on the train at a certain point. If you see something is like really, really out of style, you'll know that eventually it's going to swing back again. The second that I find really interesting is the designer Harsh Patel's association map. He uses this in his classes to actually like pinpoint how the purpose of a certain piece of design, what the purpose of a certain piece of design is. And the idea is that any piece of design can fall on a set of 2 axes. There's personal or shared. The personal is something that you do private, it's made for like yourself, and shared is something that's done for a public. And then actual and abstract. Actual is something that's really straightforward, figurative. Abstract is something that's vague and fuzzier and weirder. And once you understand that design can fall in any of those poles, there's not one way of doing design, there's not one audience for design, it opens things up to a greater sense of possibility. And then my last and possibly my favorite is Desmond Wong's redesigned expanding brain meme template, which was a toss-off Twitter joke from a couple of years ago, back when everybody was doing the expanding galaxy brain thing. If anybody's been on the internet, you may have seen that. But this is, instead of taking the galaxy brain to being extending levels, the joke is that you have like a clever idea that gets more and more and more intense as you go along. This shows that a clever idea can expand, get more and more intensely good, and then fall back to being something really, really dumb and stupid easily. Which brings me to Comic Sans. I wanted to talk about Comic Sans partly to justify using it at the beginning, but also because I find that it's something that exists at all of these sort of points that I'm talking about earlier. So we're all familiar with Comic Sans. It, of course, came out as a byproduct of the development of Microsoft Bob, which was an amazing failure on Microsoft's part in 1995. For those of you that aren't familiar, Microsoft Bob was created to be like a sort of overlay of Windows that would simplify computers to non-computer people. So instead of going to a computer and like finding an icon and typing a bunch of stuff, you would do everything by having a cartoon house that you would decorate with certain things. So here there's like a nice chair that you can sit in. There's a day planner. There's a bag of money. There's a calendar over the fireplace. These are all things that you can do on your nice, exciting computer. You'll notice in the bottom right corner, there's a little cartoon dog that will give you hints on how to use things. When they were making this program, the type designer, Vincent Canar, who was employed by Microsoft at the time, was really horrified that the programmers had set the cartoon speech bubble in Times New Roman. He was like, it's a speech bubble, it needs to be in a comic book font. But basically in a couple of evenings, in just a really quick amount of time, he dashed out Comic Sans and was like, this is great. And everyone got excited, but then the programmers came back and said like, oh, the spacing doesn't fit. our programming, so we can't use it. And so they still wound up with Times New Roman anyway. Fascinating thing is that because he worked for Microsoft, Microsoft owned it, and so they just bundled it with Windows, and then here we are in 2019, and Comic Sans is everywhere. Interestingly enough, when you think about the fact that it was made for a sort of authentic purpose. Times New Roman is not authentic for speech bubbles, but comic book text would be. Now, I'm going to do a little detour here and talk about Philip K. Dick, who is a science fiction writer. He is famous for a number of things. He did Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the basis of Blade Runner. The Man in the High Castle, which is a great book based off that was the inspiration for the Amazon program of the same name. And a crazy book called Valis. He did tons of stuff. He basically was he had a career as a pulp sci-fi writer. He did like lots of amphetamines, wrote prolifically, basically was this like frantic freelance writer who kind of got crazier and crazier as he got older. He had this like epic event happen in his life where after recovering from some kind of terrible illness slash surgery, he was on a tremendous amount of pain medication and got a delivery to his home of a woman brought some more pain medication to his house. And when she showed up, she has this like Christian fish necklace that hit the light in a certain way, blinded his eyes, and he saw this as this like divine message. And he basically like changed his life, okay? He started obsessing with the idea that the Roman Empire had never ended and that we were basically living in Roman times, and saw this as a parallel to the sort of societies of control that he was writing about in his own books. In the book in the middle, Valis, which is probably one of the craziest ones and based off of this event, he has a setting where, this is a quote from it, once in a cheap science fiction novel, Fat, that's one of the main characters, his name was Fat, had come across a perfect description of the Black Iron Prison. It's set in the far future. So if you superimpose the past, ancient Rome, over the present, California in the 20th century, and superimposed the far future world of the Android Crimea River over that, you got the Empire as the supra or trans-temporal constant. Everyone who had ever lived was literally surrounded by the iron walls of the prison. They were all inside it, and none of them knew it. So he's talking about this like societal control, and he's implying this Roman connection that has always existed. But looking at this, it like immediately struck me that he's actually talking in a certain sense about typography. He was a writer. He made his living doing writing. He basically was an obsessive writer who was hammering stuff out all the time. Think about an idea about a black iron prison. If you think about metal, you think about metal type. But then if you also think about the Roman Empire, you realize the fact that our alphabet is essentially, especially the capitals, like completely unbroken from the Roman influence. We are, if you imagine that visual communication is something that connects us all, the Roman Empire is basically in control of our visual and linguistic communication. That brings the question, how can we resist the empire with its own visual language? How do you break out of it? If you want to do something new, if you want to resist this sort of impulse, what's left to do? And so then there's Comic Sans. Here in Spain, this is a bunch of random pictures on the internet. I'm kind of fascinated. One of my we have Photoshop colleagues is from Spain, and is always going on about the fact that there's like always like Comic Sans everywhere. And Spain, of course, has like a really strong Roman history. When you think about the idea of this whole Philip K. Dick Roman idea, the Black Iron Prison, you think about Comic Sans as something that basically rejects that Roman impulse, but at the same time works within the means of production to be a perfectly functional, perfectly legible typeface. In a certain sense, it's almost like a sort of protest. It's a sort of resistance. At the same time, Comic Sans is able to be everything at once. It exists on every axis of each of these diagrams. It's both mass market and a revival at the same time. It can be personal and shared. It's also brilliant, completely brilliant, and the worst possible idea, the best possible idea, and the worst possible idea. So thinking about this requires us to imagine all of these diagrams in a single advanced multidimensional hyperspace. We have to conceive this as an in-dimensional zone, but to possibly put this in a way that could maybe a little bit more simpler, it's basically Howard the Duck. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I want to go back to these diagrams, these record covers again. Both of these have issues that might make them failures. The Four Seasons is so over the top, it's almost obscure. It feels at times like it's completely inauthentic put on by the band. It has nothing to do at all with how they were perceived or understood in culture at the time. It feels like somebody basically trying to be hip. It's that Steve Buscemi, how are you doing kids.jpg. The Congos is a total formal mess. Its roughness teeters on the verge of feeling tossed off and almost obscuring the brilliance of the work that went into it from all directions. But at the same time, they're both truly, truly great. The Four Seasons is so over the top that its reception doesn't matter, even though it was a commercial or cultural. It wasn't a commercial or cultural success. As an artifact of something weird and slippery, it's unimpeachable. The Congos is a near-perfect artifact of a group of people working to overcome extreme technological and cultural limitations. Seen in this light, its failures, what we'd normally consider bad design, are total and complete triumphs. Both of these fall in the sort of complicated, mushy place as Comic Sans, simultaneously in and out of style, good and bad, authentic and inauthentic. And then taking all this in, maybe the way something becomes good isn't really about the way it looks at all, but instead about how it's made and why it's made, who it's made for, and who it's made with. If we can expand our definitions of design to allow for more oddness and complexity, we can create design that's truly about openness and possibility. Okay? And that, my friends, is the end. Don't forget to finish high school. All right. Thanks, everyone.